that's really interesting, Claudine. Could you talk a little bit about the other data we saw at San Antonio with in 2019 about the oral tyrosine kinase inhibitor tucatinib?
Sure. So that was another really exciting presentation. So those were the results from the HER2CLIMB study, which were published recently in the New England Journal of Medicine. And what tucatinib is it's a tyrosine kinase inhibitor. It's irreversible, and it targets HER1 and HER2. And what this trial was a randomized phase 3 study that looked at patients. The key on this, again, is eligibility. So this is really looking, I think, at least in the US, at the group of patients that we would be thinking of in the third line setting. So all patients had to have had prior trastuzumab, pertuzumab, and T-DM1. And the randomization in this trial was to patients all got Xeloda and trastuzumab. They either got tucatinib with that, or it was placebo-controlled or placebo. And what they saw in that study were, again, impressive findings looking at comparing what we achieved with the addition of tucatinib in this setting. And probably the highest level thing, and the thing that I think is one of the two things that are the most worthwhile endpoints or to retain from the study, is that there was an overall survival benefit again. And it was not negligible. It was about a 4.5 month prolongation overall survival for the group of women who got the tucatinib on top of the CAPE and the trastuzumab in this setting. The other thing that was really interesting, this trial specifically allowed patients with brain metastases. It actually required patients to have an MRI prior to going on study, and just under half of the patients had brain metastases. And that group got benefit from the addition of tucatinib. And I think what's important to note is it's not just the group of patients who had brain metastases who derived benefit. It was both patients who had brain mets and patients who did not have brain mets. And the progression-free survival benefit was very similar in both of those groups. If you looked at PFS overall, there was a benefit. If you looked at PFS in patients who had brain mets and who didn't, there was a very similar degree of benefit, and the same thing for overall survival. So I think this is something that we can really think of for our patients who have brain mets. But I think it's a very definitive type of trial in a group of patients where we would really be considering this agent today in the US in terms of how we practice.
Yeah, it's, I think, a really fascinating study. And of course, it was great to have the data published at the same time and see the reduced rate. Although people get diarrhea, the rate is much less than others. We saw data at ASCO this last year in 2019 about the NALA trial, and also a trial done in China with pyrotinib and capecitabine, other oral tyrosine kinase inhibitors. At ASCO this year, ASCO last year in 2019, we saw interesting data from the NALA trial with neratinib and a trial with another oral tyrosine kinase inhibitor from China called pyrotinib. Priyanka, can you just briefly tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the NALA trial was also a third-line trial in patients who'd received prior 2 lines of therapy and randomized between capecitabine and lapatinib versus neratinib plus capecitabine. And unlike HER2CLIMB, where 100% of patients had received what we would consider traditional first and second line treatment, pertuzumab in first line and T-DM1 second line. In NALA, I think it was about 50% that had received T-DM in second line, and much less first line pertuzumab. There was no difference in median PFS, but per the trial design, which allowed them to do analysis looking at means, if the separation of curves was a little bit later, which is what was seen in the NALA trial, they noted a difference in mean PFS of about 2 months, I think. And also noted less proportion of patients needing intervention for CNS disease on the neratinib arm compared to lapatinib arm. They did not report any data in terms of responses in the brain per se. And actually, neratinib plus capecitabine was approved last month by FDA to be used after failure of 2 prior lines of HER2 targeted therapy. The approval doesn't specify which types of prior lines of HER2 therapy needed to be delivered in the first and second line setting. So one of the toxicities, although of this combination, is diarrhea, and we've seen that with other trials with neratinib, especially when you combine with capecitabine. in spite of anti-diarrhea prophylaxis, patients had significant grade 3 diarrhea. About, I think, 20-25% of patients in the neratinib arm had grade 3 diarrhea. So this has been one of the limiting factors in terms of utilization of this drug, which has been available to us to use in adjuvant setting. The other trial with pyrotinib came out of China. And again, I think China does not have, during the time this trial was conducted, it did not have approval of pertuzumab and just barely got approval of TDM1. So even though this was a third-line trial, patients hadn't received pertuzumab and TDM1, and addition of pyrotinib to capecitabine did show improvement in progression-free survival. So from that standpoint, the trial met its primary endpoint. The median PFS prolonged from 4 versus 11 months in this trial. Again, the caveats being the comparator arm wouldn't necessarily be considered standard in regions where we have pertuzumab and TDM1 available.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really interesting because the pyrotinib trial, this huge PFS benefit, more than what we've seen with other oral tyrosine kinase inhibitors, and also a benefit in patients with brain metastases. But I think the key with that trial is that some of the patients hadn't actually ever received trastuzumab. So they were a relatively, treatment naive group of patients who didn't have access to other therapies. Regardless, having additional agents available to patients who don't have access to other therapies in other countries where they're the drugs are effective is a really great thing. I don't know that pyrotinib will really have a role in what we are looking at right now.